We're on page 268. We are going to learn the interaction between Yaakov and his son Yosef right before Yaakov's death, and we're going to see it, I hope, with fresh eyes. Like all these narratives, we want to, we have in our head what takes place, but I think it's always worth going back to the text, reading the text carefully, and seeing if what we always knew is exactly the way it should be understood. Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump in. So, Pasuk Chavtes, verse 29. If you're on page 269, it's verse 29, 268, Chavtes. Okay, so says the Torah, Vayikruvu Yemei Yisrael Lamus. It was the time of Yosef, it was the days of Yosef. Yisrael recognized, meaning Yisrael is another name for Yaakov, he recognized that his life was coming to an end. He was quite old. Vayikra livno li Yosef, and he calls his son Yosef. Vayomer lo, and he says to him, Imna matzasi chen beinecha, if I find favor in your eyes, Simna yadcha tachas yirechi. Place your hand by my thigh. Ve'asisa imadi chesed ve'emes, and perform both kindness and truth with me. What is the big favor? Alna sikbereni b'Mitzrayim. Do not bury me in Egypt. Okay, so let's understand what's going on over here. So first of all, Yaakov at this point was not ill, but he recognized he's getting older, and it's important as we get older to start planning ahead, making life plans or plans for our passing, where we're going to be buried, what's going to be done. So Yaakov is doing that. This is seen in many shuls, by the way. This Shabbos is seen as a Shabbos where a lot of rabbis will speak about end-of-life planning. The importance of planning, making the plans, like, medical directives, a will, making sure all those things are in order, and we are inspired by Yaakov, who went ahead and did so. You don't wait until you can no longer make those plans. It's important to make those plans early. Okay, so he calls his son Yosef over. What's the big ask? What's the one thing he wants? Bury me in Israel. Okay, he says, put your hand by my thigh. That's a way of taking an oath in the ancient world. Okay, bury me in Israel. Now, why does he call Yosef over? Why is he asking Yosef to do this? Why doesn't he call Ruvain, Yehuda? Why Yosef? Any thoughts? He has the power. Good. Rashi says exactly that Yosef is the one who has the power to help him. Yosef is a man of authority, right? Yosef is second in command in Egypt. So if there's anyone who's going to ensure that this actually happens, ask the person who's able to help you. He therefore asks Yosef. That's the simple understanding of what he's doing. However, and here we're going to already start seeing maybe a bit of a different perspective. If you recall from earlier classes, in the ancient world, how do you get citizenship? Let's start here. In the modern world, how do you get citizenship in a country? It's where the most natural way is where you're born. If you're born in the United States, you become a citizen of the United States.
Not always.
What do you mean?
In Germany.
It wasn't like that? So. Interesting. Okay. In the Western world, or part of the Western world, it's where you're born. In the ancient world, there's no real thing of citizenship, but the thing that matters the most is not where you're born, but where you're buried. Where you're buried. If you look at Parshas Chaye Sarah, where Avram is negotiating to buy a plot of land, a lot of the subtext over there is revolving around this idea. The people are saying, yeah, you could be buried here, but not your plot of land. You'll be buried in the guest section. And Avram says, no. I want my own plot for my family, because what really is going on over there is this question of whose land is it? And Avram is trying to make sure that he has a real, not just being buried, but has a plot of land that is seen as his. So being buried somewhere indicates that's who you really are, right? And that's why in Judaism there is a big emphasis. Many people, even if they don't live in Israel, will want to be buried in Israel for this reason. It shows their real connection to the land, and that's one of the reasons. So with that in mind, we could perhaps understand that there's a second thing that's happening over here. We'll see more about that perhaps in addition to the pragmatic reason that he's calling Yosef over, that he wants to have Yosef because Yosef is the one who can help him, perhaps he's also trying to impart a lesson specifically to Yosef. And again, keep in mind, Yosef is the son who spent the least amount of time in Israel. He's the one who left as a teenager and lived most of his life in Egypt, right? And here he's telling him it's critical that I get buried in Israel. Okay, so
he's not saying that though. He's saying don't
bury me in Egypt. That's true.
So
but
he's not saying where to bury.
No. Sorry. I stopped early. You're right. Let's read the next pasuk. You're right. But read the next. No, you're right. I stopped too short. So if you read the next verse, what does it say? Verse 30, Pasuk Lamed. V'shachavti im avosai, rather let me rest with my ancestors. Unasasani b'Mitzrayim, carry me from Egypt. Ukvartani b'kvurasam, and bury me with my family in that burial plot. You're right. I stopped early. Vayomar, and Yosef said, Anochi eseh kidvarecha, I will do like you said. Okay? So let's keep on reading. Vayomer, and he says to him, Hishavali, I want you to make an oath. In other words, it's not enough that Yosef says, I'll do it, right? So again, there's some tension over here, right? Yosef says, no problem. He says, I don't want a yes, I want proof. So he says, Hishavali, make an oath. Vayishavalo, Yosef makes that oath, okay? And therefore, so it seems like he's trying to really emphasize this matter. It's not enough that Yosef said, I'll do it. He really wants to make this clear, okay? And then the end of the pasuk, Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamita, Yisrael or Yaakov bows to the head of his bed. Now, why does he bow to the head of his bed? That seems like a funny. If I want to be grateful to you, I say thank you so much, and I bow to you. Why is he bowing to the head of his bed? What's that all about? Any thoughts? Strange, right? So Rashi says this idea, very interesting idea, that when someone is ill, the divine presence rests over someone's bed. Because when a person's ill, they need extra help from Hashem. And therefore, at the top of his bed, there is the divine presence, and therefore he is bowing now, not to Yosef, but to God, because he's being grateful to God for helping him. That's how Rashi understands it. However, the Hamek Davar, the Netziv, says, no, he wants to thank Yosef, but he's also being very careful not to bow directly to Yosef. Why would he be careful not to bow directly to Yosef? So if you were here 2 weeks ago, you would remember maybe, I know it's a while ago, that there was a lot of tension between Yaakov and Yosef when they finally reunited. Again, remember, according to one approach, the whole reason that Yosef did this whole charade and was tricking everyone was because he wanted to fulfill his dreams. Remember, he had these dreams, everyone bows to him, and Yosef's whole charade of pretending he's someone else and all that, according to the Ramban and the Hamek Davar, the Netziv, suggests that the whole reason that he's going through this whole charade is to get Yaakov and the brothers to bow to him in a submissive fashion. And so the Hamek Davar suggests the reason Yaakov is not bowing to him directly over here is because Yaakov is still a little bit upset at him. Remember, I know if you weren't here, don't worry about what I'm saying, but the point is that Yosef engaged in this whole charade to get Yaakov and the brothers to bow to him, and Yaakov was like, We're not fulfilling those dreams. That was a mistake. You shouldn't have went through this whole thing to fulfill the dreams. And therefore, while he is being grateful to him and he's showing him a bow, he doesn't want to bow directly to him because that would be fulfilling his dreams. And Yaakov thinks that Yosef should not have been trying to fulfill his dreams. Okay, if you didn't catch all that, don't worry about it. Let's go further. Okay, now it's worth pointing out that the next section, the next pasuk begins a new section, right? It's a new chapter in the way it's written over here, but also in the Torah. You see that little gap over there between the words? It's a new section. So now there's going to be a new interaction between Yaakov and Yosef. You'll see why I'm mentioning that. Let's read it. Vayhi acharei hadvar ma'ela. It was after these matters. Vayomer li Yosef hine avicha chole, and it was said to Yosef, your father is sick. Okay, it seems like we know that Yosef is not living near his father. The family was living in a city called Goshen, and Yosef was in the capital of Egypt. Some say that, and so Yosef is not interacting with him on a regular basis, so a messenger is sent to Yosef to tell him, hey, you need to know your father's not well, come and check on him. Vayikach es shnei vanav imo, and Yosef took his 2 sons with him, es Menashe ves Ephraim, his 2 sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Vayagid liYaakov, and it was told to Yaakov, Vayomer hine bincha Yosef ba'elecha, your son Yosef is coming, is coming to you. In other words, it seems like at this point, perhaps Yaakov's vision is a little bit diminished, or his, and therefore he's not able to see exactly what's in front of him, and therefore it's told to him, your son is coming, your son is here. Vayischazek Yisrael, and Yaakov, or Yisrael, strengthened himself. Vayeshev alamita, and he sat on his bed. Okay, he sits on the bed, ready to greet Yosef and his sons. Vayomer Yaakov el Yosef, and now Yaakov tells Yosef, Kel Shakai Nira Elai Beluz be'eretz Canaan Vayavorach Osi. So now Yaakov starts telling a whole story to Yosef. He says, God appeared to me in Canaan, which was Israel, in a city called Luz, and he blessed me. Vayomer Elai, and he said to me, Hineni mafracha virbisicha. I am going to make you fruitful and multiply. Okay, so he gives him this blessing. I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply. Now let's pause for a second. When was Yaakov in the city of Luz? Okay, this is a hard question to answer, but let's review Yaakov's life. Yaakov was born in Israel. He is a teenager in again what was then called Canaan. He has that interaction with Esav where he steals the blessings from, he gets the blessings from Yitzchak, and then at that point he is told, you got to run because Esav wants to kill you. He spends decades in Padan Aram, outside of Israel, and then while he's away, he has how many sons? He has 11 sons, okay? The last son, Binyamin, is going to be born in Israel, but he has 11 sons outside of Israel, and then he returns. It's at that moment that God appears to him and says, I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply. Okay? That's what we're reading over here. So Yosef is being told this story. By the way, when we came back to the land of Israel, God told me, I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply. Unisaticha lekal amim. I'll make you like a big nation. V'nasati sa'aretz hazos lizaracha acharecha achuzas olam. And I'll give this land to your children after you as an eternal inheritance. Okay, so God appears to him and gives him two blessings. He says, I am going to make you fruitful and multiply, and I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you this land. Those are the two things that are told to Yaakov when he returns to Israel. Okay? Ve'ata, and now. Shnei vanecha hanoladim lecha be'eretz Mitzrayim. The two sons that were born to you in Egypt. Ad boi elecha Mitzrayima. Until I came to Egypt. Lihem. They, quote unquote, belong to me. We'll have to see what that means. But they belong to me. Ephraim u'Menashe. Ephraim and Menashe, ki Ruvain v'Shimon Yoli. They'll be to me just like Ruvain and Shimon are to me. Okay? So that's what he tells them. Again, it's a strange dialogue. Let's try to recap. Yosef comes to visit his father who is ill. He's on his deathbed now. And his father tells him, I want to tell you a story. When I came back to the land of Israel, God appeared to me. He told me I will be fruitful, I'll be fruitful, and I'll multiply. And he says, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you the land of Israel, and you're going to be fruitful and multiply. And now your children, Ephraim and Menashe, are like Reuven and Shimon. What's the connection over here? It's like a lot of different ideas which don't seem to be so connected one with the other. Why is he telling him all this? In other words, if all he's trying to do is say Ephraim and Menashe are very special to me, say that. Why is he saying God promised me the land? He said you're going to be fruitful and multiply. What are all those pieces doing over here? So the classic understanding is that what he's telling him is like this. God promised me the land of Israel. That means that my children are going to inherit the land of Israel. Now, how are they going to inherit the land of Israel? They're going to divide it by tribes, right? Each tribe is going to get, one portion of the land. Yehuda's going to get one portion. Reuven's going to get another portion. So what Yaakov is conveying right now to Yosef, he's saying, listen, I was given the land of Israel, and I want to go ahead and give a double portion to you, Yosef. In other words, Yosef now is effectively getting a double portion, because it's not just Yosef's getting one portion. Now his children, Ephraim and Menashe, are like the older generation. They are equivalent to the previous generation, and therefore they're also going to get a plot of land. So what seems the simple understanding of what's going on over here is that Yaakov is telling Yosef, the land is given to me, so it's mine to give out to others, and I want to go ahead and give your children a double inheritance of that land. That's what's being conveyed. Make sense? Make sense? And some point out there's an interest. Why does he have to mention the promise that I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply? So some understand what that means is that Yaakov thinks to himself, I had 11 sons, and God says you're now going to be fruitful and multiply. Typically, fruitful and multiply means how many children? There's a law in Judaism the first mitzvah is be fruitful and multiply, right? So our sages tell us that means you have to have you should have 2 children. In other words, fruitful and multiply, a minimum is that basically fruitful and multiply means not just one but more, right? So Yaakov's thinking to himself, God says you're going to be fruitful and multiply, and yet he only has one son after he enters the land of Israel. So where is the fulfillment of being fruitful and multiplying if I only had one son? So the grandchildren. So Yaakov says, it's your 2 children who are seen as my extension. They're really seen as my children. Reuven v'Shimon Yoli, they're like the tribes. When God gave me that blessing, it was a reference to your children. That's how this all fits together. Okay? That's how some understand this. Now it's interesting, it's worth noting, it's a little strange. The whole story, if you want to take one takeaway from the whole story of Yosef and the brothers, if you were writing a parenting manual after reading the story of Yosef and his brothers, there's one takeaway. Okay, what's the takeaway? Don't play favorites. You may like one kid more than the other, but you better not, make mention of it, right? You gotta love sorry? Jealousy. Right, creates jealousy. This whole crazy saga happened because of jealousy. What's Yaakov doing now, right? Same thing, right? The 2 sons, Yosef, he's still picking Yosef. Yosef, you're gonna get a double inheritance, right? Really? Right? You didn't learn your lesson? Well, hello, where were you, right? For 2 decades, you're missing your son because they wanted to kill him, right? What's happening over here? So a couple of points that are worth mentioning. So first of all, there's something, I'm actually going to read it because it's I think a beautiful quote from Rav Adin Steinsaltz. Rav Adin Steinsaltz was a brilliant thinker, passed away a few years ago, and he addresses this notion of a lack of equality in the Jewish worldview. Forget this story for a second. The fact that there is a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew, or there's a difference between a Kohen, a Levi, and Yisrael. In other words, Judaism is full, or men and women, right? Throughout Judaism, there is a constant notion of not everything is equal, right? The fact that I can't ever get that first aliyah in Shul because the Kohen is more elevated, and I can't go to certain places when the temple is rebuilt because the Kohen was more elevated, etc., etc. Judaism does not seem to subscribe with this purely egalitarianism ideal. And Rabbi Steinsaltz says something beautiful. I'm going to read it. It's a quote. Egalitarian ideas are not supported by any evidence. So here he's sharing a philosophical idea. He says, where does this notion of egalitarian, that everything should be equal? It's not supported by anything. He says, on the contrary, the inequality of man is blatantly apparent. The only way, meaning, for example, he'll elaborate. Okay, the only way one can find any support for the idea of equality is in a very difficult religious concept, the concept that people are born in the image of God and are therefore equal in some fundamental way. Says Ray Steinsaltz, the whole notion of equality doesn't really make any sense. In the ancient world, equality, what says the word equality? They would have laughed you out of the room. Equality. Go tell the Roman, the caste system that existed in every single, that there's equality. What are you talking about? This person's subhuman. This person is God, deity. This person is somewhere in the middle. What? Who's equal, right? He says there's nothing, and he says, where does the whole idea of equality come from? It comes from the Torah. The Torah which says that you and I and everyone, and Jew and non-Jew, everyone has an image of God in them. Oh, that means that on some fundamental level, we actually are equal. There might still be differences, but it's specifically through the Torah that the whole notion of any level of equality is introduced. He says, there is no other argument that I've heard that serves any purpose. All egalitarian movements are an outcome of Judeo-Christian ideas that contain within them the notion of receiving a divine soul that for everyone is more or less the same. Okay, then he continues. All forces everywhere, within and without, work against equality. People are so inherently different, not only different, but unequal, that it requires a constant struggle to accept the notion of some kinds of equality. Think about it, right? The notion, are we really all that equal? Some of us, some people have, IQs, over here. Some people have IQs over here. Some people are strong. Some people are weak. I mean, are we really equal? What are you talking about, right? What are you, this notion that we're all equal really, defies nature. Right? If you look at the world from a purely non-religious perspective, to suggest this notion that we're all equal is a joke. It's not apparent in any way. It's because of this idea that we believe that we all share this divine soul, right? He says the only justification for the idea is what you may call a mystical one. Even though people don't appear to be equal, there's something equal in them. From this point of view, whether it is a good thing or not such a good thing, hierarchy seems to me to be a given element inherent in creation and in nature. This is nature. Everything else is an attempt to change nature. Okay, so end quotes. But basically, his basic point is that, first of all, the whole premise of our question of, hey, why are you playing favorites? It's worth noting, I'm not addressing the question fully, but the point is that for Yaakov to go ahead and say, this one should be more elevated than that one, is not a crazy idea. On the contrary, the idea that everyone should be equal, in some ways, is more problematic, right? And so it's that's something that's worth keeping in mind. And it's also worth noting that there's a major difference over here. Whereas Yosef was treated with favoritism early in his life, this is already in his deathbed. There's constant, while the children are still developing. This is at the end of Yaakov's life, where he's showing that there's someone who's more elevated than the other. And again, Rav Steinsaltz's point is, that makes sense. On the contrary, to say that there's any level of equality is the chiddush, is the novelty. Okay, that's one way of looking at this, but let's go on. There's a few other ways of addressing this. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests that, he says equality is good, but treating everyone exactly the same is also very foolish. In other words, equality is not the same. If we say every single person, egalitarianism, we should therefore treat everyone the same. Does that make sense? In other words, if some child needs special help, you're going to say, well, I treat everyone the same. I'm not going to give that child extra help because I've treated everyone the same. Or one child is extremely gifted. I'm not going to give this kid extra work because they're all the same. That makes no sense, right? In other words, there's a balancing act between equality on the one hand and favoritism on the other. And so that's just also a worldview. And lastly, another approach, which I think is also very straightforward, and that is that why in Judaism does the firstborn get double portion? You ever thought about that? Where does that come from? What's the rational reason? If we had to theorize, why would the firstborn get a double portion? Any firstborns here? Okay, I'm not. What's it called? But
I'm a first.
You're a firstborn. Okay, so you, I imagine, they're the firstborn. Certainly in the not so ancient world. I think I mentioned this to you in the past. They look at the what do they call the mass of the people who came to America in the early years. None of them were firstborns. None of them were firstborns. Why was that?
Inherited the land.
Exactly. The eldest inherited the lands, but there was a second piece. The eldest of the land had a responsibility. If you look throughout the entire Talmud, the eldest of the family, yes, they get a double portion, but it comes with a responsibility. Their job is to ensure that the rest of the family is cared for, right? So the eldest gets more, but not because they're going to go and buy a yacht now, because they're going to use that money to go support everyone else. The reason that the second, it wasn't the first who came, because everyone in England or whatever, they had their own land. It was the seconds who weren't getting enough support from the eldest child, and therefore they said, forget this, I'm going to go find a place in Louisiana, or maybe not initially, but whatever. The point is that they, that's the rationale behind it. So who's the one who's taking care of the other children at this stage? The firstborn. And in this storyline in Egypt, who is the son who is taking care of the rest of the family? Yosef. He's the one who's literally caring for them. He's feeding them. He's doing everything. So it actually follows quite logically that he should get some form of a double, something extra, because he is the one who has to support and take care of the others. Okay, so far so good. Okay, let's try to go a little further, and we'll try to make a little more sense of this. Okay, yeah. Good question. Good.
I'm Ruvain. I'm saying, wait a minute.
Correct. So it's a good question. I mean, it's a fair question. One point. I'm not sure if it's a fair answer, but one point that is made by the Ramban and others is that they only kept the Torah in Israel. It's an easy answer. Okay, but think about it. Meaning, when is Yaakov married to two sisters? Only while he's in Israel. When they come to the land, God kind of orchestrates things. He's only married to one, right? So we'll keep that in our back pocket as a possible answer. Okay, says Yaakov further, verse 6, Pasuk Vav. And the children that are born afterwards, in other words, let's say you have more children, they go to you, Al Shem Achem, Yikra ben Achalasam. If you have more children, they're not going to get a third portion and a fourth portion. Instead, they're going to be subsumed under Ephraim and Manasseh. In other words, Yaakov says, I'm giving you double, I'm not giving you triple, quadruples. Don't start having 20 children now and start having, it's not going to work. Ephraim and Manasseh, that's it. Anyone after that just gets subsumed into Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, now here's where it gets very, very strange. Pasuk Zayin. Vani bevoi mipadan. When I was coming back, so Yaakov continues and now starts sharing with Yaakov a little story. When I was returning from Padan Aram, that's where he lived with Lavan, that's out of Israel, right? Mesa alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan baderech. Rachel, your mother, Yosef, your mother died while we were traveling. Ba'od kivras aretz levo Ephrasa, like at a distance from Ephrat. Ephrasa is Ephrat. Ve'ek bereha sham bederech Ephras, and I buried her on the way to Ephrat. He Beis Lachem in Bethlehem, in Beis Lachem. Okay? She just tells him this little story. By the way, on my way back from Padan Aram, your mother died. I buried her on the way. What's this doing here? Thoughts?
It's sort of like the other part, the inverse, what the inequality here. His mother is not going to be buried like Leah with the patriarchs.
Yeah.
So he has to give a rational explanation to cover this problem.
So he has to give a rational, but why is he giving this rational explanation over here? Meaning, what's it doing over here?
He's trying to explain.
I agree. He's certainly trying to it sounds like he's trying to justify something. He's trying to explain why Rachel is being treated differently than Leah. All the patriarchs and matriarchs, the Avos and Imos, are being buried in Maras Machpelah. Rachel was not. Good. And Yosef possibly is bothered by this. Explain it to Yosef. Good. Why now?
He was afraid that Yosef may have in the back of his mind that since he was buried, she's not going to be buried. He could have taken her, made the effort to take her to the Maras Machpelah and buried her there.
So why is he bringing this up over here?
He was afraid that Yosef may not bury him and not fulfill his.
Okay. Good. So Rashi says this approach. Rashi says that the reason that he's saying this is because he asked Yosef to bury him in Israel. It's a far trip from Egypt to Israel. Yosef's busy. He's a statesman, right? He has all the excuses in the world not to bury him there. It's quite far. So he says, listen, your mother died. I would have loved to bury her in this place. Things happen. I had no control. It's a form of an apology. But again, the agenda over here is he's trying to, make sure that Yosef buries him in Israel. That's what Rashi says. But there's one major problem with this, and that is, remember, there were two interactions between Yaakov and Yosef. In the beginning, right, in Pasuk Chavtes, verse 29 through 31, Yosef goes to Yaakov, and Yaakov says, "Please bury me in Israel." Swear to me, good, done. Don't bury me in Mitzrayim. And then he says, again, bury me to the place of my parents, right? The next pasuk. Don't bury me in Egypt, bring me to Israel. That conversation ends. Weeks, months, years later, we don't know exactly. There is a new dialogue where the burial is not brought up at all. In this dialogue, the only thing that's happening is that Yosef is his sons are getting some double portion over here. And now he brings that up. It just seems like the wrong place. It should have been brought up in the chapter before, when he's having this dialogue around, please bury me in Israel. Why is he bringing it up over here? It doesn't seem to fit, right? There's a question some people ask on Rashi's approach, because if the whole idea was he was trying to ensure that Yosef wouldn't say, well, I'm going to get you back because you didn't bury my mother, then he should have said that earlier in the last conversation. But this story is taking place weeks or months or years later, right? It's a whole different chapter, a whole different section. Why is it being brought up over here? Okay, so the Malbim suggests, he says like this. He says what he's trying to convey to Yosef is a little complicated, bear with me, but he says like this. He says that it goes back to what I said before. God appeared to Yaakov as he's entering the land of Israel and says, I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply, right? I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply, which implies you're going to have more than one child, right? And then immediately afterwards, his main wife, Rachel, dies. Where's his extra children going to come from? Right? And so it's because of the juxtaposition between these two things, where he only has one child after that blessing, and he therefore recognizes there has to be more than one child, and Rachel dies immediately afterwards. Rachel is his main wife, and therefore he's saying, I'm explaining, why am I not taking Reuven's children to be the ones, the double portion, or Shimon's children, or Levi's children? It makes sense to be you, because your mother died at this point. She would have been the one through whom I would have had more children, yet she died. So it must be that it's going to be fulfilled through your descendants, and you have two children. And that's why he's specifically telling him this in this context. That's what the Malbim says to answer this question. Okay, it's an answer. The Netziv says something very strange. He says very, very strange. He says almost the exact opposite and really turns this whole episode on its head. Okay, he says like this. The Netziv says, God just promised him the land. Okay, now there is a Rachel dies a little bit, in a bad situation. She dies during childbirth. She dies on the road. This was certainly not the plan. This was certainly like something out of the ordinary. Most of the forefathers, the matriarchs, patriarchs, as far as we're concerned, they die at old age, right? They die, no illnesses or whatever illness at the end of their life, but it's not like they're not dying in an abnormal fashion. Rachel dies in an abnormal fashion, okay? She dies in an abnormal fashion. Says the Netziv, this indicated to Yaakov that there's actually going to be not something special for her children, but the opposite. The fact that she died in this abnormal fashion, right when God gave him this blessing, that your children are going to get the land, indicates that there's something missing from this family. There's something going to be, there's a detriment, there's something, a loss that's going to take place within the inheritance of the land for this particular family. You're going to be lacking in your inheritance. You with me? In other words, the juxtaposition between God's blessing that you're going to get the land of Israel and Rachel immediately dying indicates to Yaakov that there's something broken. There's an issue within that Rachel's children and their inheritance. Okay, that's what the Netziv says. He leaves it at that. He doesn't unpack it. So let's unpack it a little bit more. Okay, we mentioned earlier that the reason, I'm going to share with you like a completely alternative approach. We mentioned earlier that actually, if you want, just to read one more pasuk, which I think will shed a little bit more light. If you look at verse 8, pasuk ches, Vayar Yisrael has been a Yosef. Yaakov saw the children of Yosef. Vayomer mi eleh. And he said, who are they? Who are they? Okay, so what's that question? So the simple way we learn this as children is that Yaakov is blind. He wasn't able to see, so he doesn't know who they are. Okay. Seems a little strange, and it seems like a little strange why the Torah has to tell us this. Okay, it could be foreshadowing what's going to take place in a moment where he switches his hands, but it could be there's something more over here. Why would he say, who are these people? Right? Sometimes we say, who are these people? I really don't know who they are. But sometimes, I can imagine like, a scene in a house where, someone comes into the house and, maybe the teenage son, Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, is about to go out with his friends. And, and Shabbos, he comes upstairs and he's wearing like torn jeans and like, bomber, I don't know, some looking, not exactly so whatever. And he's saying, who is this? I don't know who you are, right? I don't recognize you. And some want to suggest that Yaakov over here, when he turns to his son and says, who are they? He's saying, I don't recognize these people. Rashi actually goes with that approach. Rashi goes with that approach and he has to show Yaakov. He says, no, I married their mother. I was a legitimate marriage. But it's more than just, I don't know who they are. There's a critique over here. What would be the critique? If we were to make an assumption over here. Yaakov and his family are dressed like Yaakov and his family, whatever the shepherds wore, their hoods and their robes and whatever. Yosef probably looked, we know he looked very Egyptian, and probably his children looked very Egyptian. I think I mentioned this last week, but it's worth mentioning again, and that is that other people have pointed out the style of the Egyptians. Aside from the immorality which the Torah tells us about, we know from watching any movie about Egyptians. What do we know about their hair? They shave their hair. They have no hair, right? Egyptians have no hair. Why is that? It actually fits perfectly with their philosophy. It's part of their philosophy. What do they do after they die, right? The Egyptians, right? Why do everyone Sorry? Mummification. They're trying to hold on to everything, and then in the tombs they go and they bring the gold and their stuff. Why? Because they're basically their whole philosophy is we're running away from death. There's no notion of we don't believe in an after, the afterworld. We're still here, right? Our hair is one of the big indicators. If you're not dyeing your hair, so either it gets lost, right, or it gets white, right, and basically you're aging, right? But in Egypt we don't want to show we're aging, right? We don't want to show we're aging because we're constantly fighting against that, right? Which is a very in Judaism. Whereas in Judaism, there's a halacha, there's a law. If an older person walks into a room, what are you supposed to do? Stand up. There's one of my favorite things in Israel, in the buses. On the buses, it has it's a pasuk from the Torah. It's not, like in Israel, it says "Vadarta penei zaken," which means you should honor an elderly person. Right in the front of the buses, it says as a reminder to stand up and give your seat to an elder. It doesn't say please stand up for your elders. It quotes a verse from the Torah, but it's beautiful. But the point is that in Judaism, we elevate, we respect elders, we recognize, we acknowledge the passing, and we recognize the next world. In Egypt, they're running away from that. And it expressed itself in their aesthetic as well, in the way they dress, the way they look. So over here, Yaakov is saying, who are these people? I don't know who these people are, right? So what's going on over here? Now, let's go back. We said that in total, the classic approach is that Yosef over here is given a double inheritance, either because he's a favorite, either because he is the one who really is caring for everyone. Sorry? Yosef dies the first, interestingly, right? That's interesting and ironic, right? But he's getting a double because of a blessing, because of a gift. There are those who want to argue that no, and based on this Netziv, he says that no. He's actually, what's happening over here is he's not getting double. He's actually, if you think about it, Yosef's actually in some ways getting less. Because what is Yaakov telling him? He's saying, your children, I'm going to give it to your children. But not you. Right? You could look at this as a blessing. You could also look at this as a punishment. He's telling Yosef, you are not going to get this. You're not going to get a portion of the land of Israel. Why not? Why not? We know why not. Because, at least according to some, simple read, and that is that Yosef is living in Egypt. He spends decades in Egypt without reaching out to his family. For all intents and purposes, he is an Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian. He acts like an Egyptian. The entire Egyptian economy is revolving around him. And the reason, let's go back to the whole story over here. These two dialogues between Yaakov and Yosef. He calls Yosef and he says, Yosef, swear to me that, bring me to the land of Israel. We asked, why did he say bring me to the land of Israel? We said, the reason is because he's the most capable. Perhaps it has nothing to do with that. Perhaps it's not a practical thing. Perhaps he's trying to convey to Yosef, it is critical that I get buried in Israel because Israel is where it's at. Israel is our real home. And Yosef says, no problem. He says, no. You didn't hear me. He shavali, swear to me. He's trying to really emphasize this point. Israel is where it's at. It's not a practical question. It's not a pragmatic question. If he wanted to get it done, he would have given it to Yehuda. He'll get it done. He wanted to convey a lesson to Yosef. Yosef, you are too comfortable in Galus. You're too comfortable in exile. You're too comfortable in Egypt, in Baltimore, in New York. And therefore he's telling him, remember, I need to be buried in Israel. Not because he needs his help. He'll get someone else to do it. He wants to convey a message. And then in the next dialogue, what happens? Yosef comes in, and he says, Yosef, I want you to know, your mother died in Egypt. That already gave me some foreshadowing. There's going to be some issues over here. And there is, because look at you. I don't recognize you. I don't really recognize your children. You're not really acting like one of the tribes. You're not really acting like one of us. You're acting like a foreigner. You're acting like an Egyptian. And because of that, you're not getting double. I'm not giving double to you. I'm skipping you. You don't deserve to get a part of the land of Israel. Your children are going to get it. You're not going to get that portion in the land of Israel, right? So a very, very different way of looking at this passage. Again, instead of a blessing, he's trying to convey to Yosef a fundamental lesson of the supremacy of not just the land of Israel, but being a Jew, being a proud Jew and not being assimilated into the culture that surrounded them. Yosef he saw as someone who really lost it to some degree, okay? Now, the good news is that the Parsha has a very powerful ending, okay? And that is like this. And that is that, as you mentioned, Yosef is the first one to die. And how does he die? What are the last words of this entire Parsha? How does he die? He says,
He wants to be buried.
take me, exactly. He says, take me to the land of Israel. Make sure I am buried there. God is going to save you. Bring me to the land of Israel. And with this, we see a story of tshuva, a story of repentance. That yes, Yosef maybe was an assimilated person to some degree, but his father gave him this powerful lessons, right? Telling him, Israel's everything, bury me in Israel. And then when he comes back, he says, you're not getting it because you're not acting like a Israel, you're not acting like my child. But thank God, within the course of years after that, Yosef changed his ways. He learned his lesson, and on his deathbed, he turns to the family and he echoes his father's words and he says, I've learned the lesson. I'm not an Egyptian. I'm not Safnas Paneach, as he was known by the Egyptians. Ani Yosef. I am Joseph, and please bury me. Make sure I'm going to be buried in the land of Israel, because that is the most important thing. The book of Bereshit finishes on such a high note. It finishes on this note where, the family reconciles. So much of the book of Bereshit involves, this tension between the brothers and jealousy, Cain and Hevel and Yaakov and Esav and Avram, Yitzchak and Ishmael, and the brothers and Yosef. And here at the final moment they embrace, and he needs them. He shows them, I'm dependent on you, right? There's this, but one of the subtle lessons is the supremacy of the land of Israel. Yes, the book ends on a sad note that they're in exile, but it ends on a note of hope, saying that even when we are outside the land of Israel, we will not lose our identity. Yosef is the paradigm of what it means to be a cosmopolitan individual, an individual who's immersed in the culture of the society, and yet he doesn't lose sight of what's important. He learned his father's lesson, make sure I come back to the land of Israel, and Yosef learns his lesson. Yes?
But it wasn't